So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Dodgson. I'm a partner and patent attorney at Abel Imray, and I'm chairing the discussion today. We've previously done a panel looking at the various different types of funding available for innovative businesses, and this discussion now focuses in on one of those, grant funding. Grant funding can be really useful instead of or as well as equity. One of its big advantages is that it's non-dilutive, so you don't have to give up any ownership of the company in exchange for the funding. And another advantage is that it can provide a motivation or a framework for partnering with other businesses, as many of the funding calls encourage or require applications from consortiums rather than single businesses. And a downside, though, is that the application process can be time consuming with little return on investment if the funding applications are unsuccessful. So in terms of what we're talking about today, I'm going to start by introducing my panelists in a second, and then they're going to talk about their experience of the funding process. We'll then talk about how to get started with grant funding, touching on which might be the main funding bodies that UK businesses would think about. We'll talk about how to increase your chances of making a successful grant application and the common mistakes that people make. And then we've also got a bit of time for Q&A at the end. And I know some of you have already sent in questions, so thanks for that. So my panelists today are Jose Videra and Tom Kennard. Jose is the co-founder and CEO of Symbiosis, a deep tech startup developing AI software that rapidly accelerates the validation of advanced materials and manufacturing processes and can condense those timescales from decades to days. Jose's been working in deep tech startups since he was 15 years old, so quite a history there, in industries such as renewable energy, oil and gas, and defence and security. And he also helped set up the London-based startup accelerator Deep Science Ventures in 2016. Tom is a director at Granted Consultancy. Granted specialises in identifying and securing grant funding to support companies bringing innovative product and technology to market. And Granted have an experienced team of funding and grant writing specialists from a variety of backgrounds who have helped secure over £100 million in funding in the last 10 years. As well as bringing his knowledge of the grant funding process, Tom also brings entrepreneurial experience, having been instrumental in scaling Granted from a startup to a top 3 UK consultancy. So thank you both very much for joining us today. So let's start with you, Jose. What role has grant funding played in the growth of your company?
It's played, an extremely significant part in the company. So we decided, I helped fund Deep Science Ventures. I actually went into the first cohort as a guinea pig of part of my own creation, and Symbiosis came out of that. We got a little bit of pre-seed funding from the Deep Science Ventures program. And since then, we've just been running on grant funding, basically. So for 4.5 years, it's been mostly through the Defence Security Accelerator grant funding program. And with their help, we've managed to scale to 7 people on payroll, which is pretty cool.
And was there a particular reason you went for grant funding? Was there something about it that worked better for you than the other options?
Yeah, so we started the company, so we're actually mid-pivot. So we started the company 4.5 years ago, trying to develop a new type of armor technology. So a new physical mechanism to absorb energy in the ballistic regime. And traditionally, when you invent or create a new material, it'll take, if you're lucky, 10 years for that material from inception to integration into a machine or building. And these timescales just don't really fit with modern day venture capitalism. Kind of your investors want to have at the most a 5-6 year kind of return on investment, and materials is just, you're an order of magnitude out from that. And the barriers to entry are a lot higher, that the costs to development are a lot higher. Progress is a little bit more linear because you literally have to be in a lab developing the material and then scaling it up to pilot scale, then putting into a large scale manufacturing process. So costs are a lot larger, the timescales are a lot larger, and we left Deep Science Ventures trying to initially go for kind of seed funding with angel investors. And their reaction was always the same, of a bit of trepidation as to how big the project was going to be. We then kind of after a few conversations and a few terrible offers from angels, we sat down, we're like, okay, how are we going to do this in a more sustainable manner, right? We're not going to give investors their money back in 5 to 6 years. It's going to be more like 10 years. But, you know, once we've made it, it's going to stay for 20 or 30 years, and like most materials innovations. How are we going to go about it? Generally, looking to government is usually the entity that funds the larger scale infrastructural kind of technologies and issues. And right, they fund fundamental research. They fund, you know, roads, railways, and all of that lot. So it was, I guess, the natural decision point came to, I guess we're gonna have to go for government funding because this is a long-term proposition. Governments are better placed to fund in longer-term propositions. So then we went into grant funding.
And is that one big grant, or has that been a process of several small grants?
It's been a process of, I think, 6 or 7 grants in total. A couple of those grants were geared specifically towards the armament material, and then a couple of other grants were to keep the lights on. But we have a lot of kind of physics and engineering kind of know-how in the company, and we were able to leverage what we knew from our kind of former lives into actually developing something that was needed within the defense security space. And all of those kind of projects have come out pretty successfully, actually. So we're pretty happy with that.
Tom, perhaps over to you. How do you fit in with the grant funding process?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So one of the principal pieces about the grant funding landscape is its complexity, and it's constantly changing, and there are lots of different funds, and all the different funds have different scopes and eligibility criteria, and they're targeted at different technology readiness levels, TRLs. They're targeted at different sectors, they're targeted at different regions. So the first bit of the process that we help with is matching the right fund to your project. I think the other bit that is critical to grant funding, as Jose's eloquently described, is it allows you to achieve something that perhaps otherwise wouldn't be achievable. So it's about shifting mindsets as well to the maximum kind of ambition of what you want to try and achieve. And it's that risk profile then between where you are today and where you want to get to that is the piece that the grant funders will support. So our help is both in matching the project to the grant funder and then helping in terms of architecting the best project for the organization and company, and then in accessing it. So we then help with the bid writing, liaising with the funders, and then once the organizations are successful, we help with the project management of the grant as you're looking to draw it down.
And so do the companies you work with tend to be at a particular stage in their growth or particular size, or is there a grant out there for everyone if you find the right grant?
Yeah, I think over time there's a grant out there for most people, but grants are effectively a mechanism for implementing macroeconomic policy. So they'll be targeted at areas of the economy that are new, bluntly, that the government doesn't know about yet. So I think it's about 2 years ago, there was suddenly 10 different drone funds within a space of like 2 months because they were a new technology, the government wasn't aware of them. So right, let's look at how they swarm together, let's look at how they communicate and all of those things. But then since then, there hasn't been any specific drone funds. So sometimes they're reactive like that. Other times they're more planned. So the current government is looking at increasing research and development as a percentage of GDP. And so they're putting in place mechanisms to achieve that. So they're targeting certain sectors. And some of those are kind of fundamental, some of those are infrastructure, again, as Jose said. And some of those are kind of as those new sectors develop. And, you know, we're in a situation at the moment where most of the people that come to us say they've got a form of AI because it's become this really popular term. And so just to confuse them, I say, what color is your AI? And if they come back with blue, then I know they haven't actually got it at all. But it's just it's a mechanism for supporting those cutting edge technologies. So our team is working on distributed ledger technology, blockchain technology, you know, 2 or 3 years before it becomes more mainstream. At the moment, we're doing a lot more work around quantum technologies, a lot of work in the hydrogen economy, but that's been happening for a fair few years as well. So those are the kind of areas. In terms of the company size, it can be anything from startup to large organizations. It's more about the project you're trying to achieve than the company size or stature. And is that project going to develop something that's really disruptive and innovative?
And so do you see disruption and innovative as being kind of a necessary criteria for a successful grant? I'm thinking a lot of the most valuable patent applications come out of kind of an incremental improvement on something that a business might already be doing, or, you know, a more efficient way of doing something. Is that kind of project with that kind of aim fundable as well through grants?
It is, yeah. There's different kind of areas of grant funding. So the innovation technology grants that we're talking about predominantly today do require that step change. You've also got mechanisms like the R&D tax credit scheme, which can look at historical spend and slightly more incremental spend, developments. And then you've got what we call capital grants, which will be very location specific and might be targeted at like a manufacturing company that wants to buy a new machine that will add 10 new FTE roles. Those type of funds, again, going back to the macroeconomic element, are more prevalent when the economy is in a poorer situation and unemployment is high. So you'll see a response in terms of the funders to what the current criteria and preferences are for the economy to develop into.
So people who think grant funding is for them, where do they start? And in terms of the UK landscape, what are kind of likely to be the main kind of target funding bodies for kind of tech-based businesses? So
the principal one to go to is Innovate UK, under the kind of UKRI banner. And then there are sector-specific ones. So you've got the DASA scheme, you've got ESA, for example, for space applications. One of the important things in both DASA and ESA is it's the application of technology to that sector. So it doesn't mean you've got to have a new satellite technology to be eligible for ESA, for example. It can be applying your technology into a space setting. But Innovate UK is the one that most people will have heard of. Probably most people have heard of the SMART grants. And the SMART grants are effectively sector agnostic. So they're relatively regular. The next one has a closing date, beginning of January. And you can be from most sectors, as long as you're developing something innovative and disruptive, and most sectors can apply to that. Alongside those are the very sector specific and call specific ones. So at the moment, there's 4 funds looking at innovation in farming. And if you're innovating in agri-tech, that's a great opportunity. The problem with those specific ones is that they're less frequent and they're less predictable. So the SMART is there to pick up. If you've got a project, you can go in for that if there's no specific calls, but we'd always recommend going for a specific call as your first option.
And do they have a higher success rate for specific calls? Or?
Yeah, because you won't be going up against other people from other sectors. So SMART generally has a success rate of around, well, it varies, but 2 to 5%. That's the kind of everybody who applies success rate, obviously not the success rate if you get help. And those more specific calls might have a success rate as high as kind of 30, possibly even 50%.
And are they a particular size? Is there a minimum size, a maximum size? Sort of what's the ballpark figure for the kind of grant you might be looking at?
Yeah, interestingly, most of the funds start at the kind of 50 to 100K of project size. Most of them will define a project size and then an intervention rate. So the intervention rate is the amount of grant you get as a percentage of the project. So for kind of, and that there are 2 things that impact that. Oh, I haven't moved in a while. There are 2 things that impact that. One is the stage of development that you're at. So earlier stage, higher risk projects have a higher intervention rate, looking at up to kind of 70, 80%. Whereas the closer you get to market, that drops as the risk profile of the innovation drops off. And also it's the size of the organization. So a large company will get a lower intervention rate than a small or a micro company. But normally you're looking at that 50 to 100K, and then the maximum, I mean, normal maximum is around the kind of 1-2 million of project size. So, you know, these are ambitious projects, and some of them go into the, you know, tens of millions pounds.
If I can add into the DASA, the statistics are roughly the same. So the Defence Security Accelerator DASA, so they have an open theme, and then they also have themed competitions as well. The success rate for the open call is a lot lower, but you can put in any sort of technology for anything that's related to the defence and security sphere. You've got a lot higher chance of success with the themed calls. The way that DASA organizes, so they've got a 2-tiered approach to a project, and they lump it as a low TRL and a mid TRL call. So low TRL means proof of concept. So from back of the envelope calculations up to a lab scale prototype, that's the kind of the initial grant call, and whilst I don't think they have a set limit on the amount on the cost of the project. They would generally recommend you not go above 100, 120,000 for that. For the mid-TRL, which is scaling from the lab scale prototype to a larger scale in the field demonstration, which is more of a kind of 1.5 to 2 year project, that also doesn't have a cap. And there are some projects that have been funded up to about £1 million, but generally you'll experience a severe decrease in your chance of getting accepted if you go above £350,000.
And how was it you came to sort of apply to DASA? Was that chance? How did you come across them? What was your process for working out that they'd be a useful place for you to go?
Yeah, there was a double-pronged reason to this, actually. So firstly, when I was in the Deep Science Ventures program, we were spending hours trying to find all forms of kind of grant opportunities out there, not just in the UK, but in Europe when we were a part of it. And I'd found DASA. So DASA had just been created. It used to be called something else. I think it was called the CD, and it was part of the STL. They just rebranded themselves, turned into their own standalone funding body. As I was in Deep Science Ventures back in 2017. So I actually applied to the first competition that they released when they were created. Secondly to that, so one of our kind of founding board advisors of the company, Professor Deep Chana from Imperial College, he is kind of well integrated into the UK and NATO defense security space. And he also recommended that we look into this new funding body, DASA, and that they might be really interested in what we have to offer. Yeah.
And Jose's raised it, so I'll ask, although I hate to mention Brexit, has that changed the landscape? Because I'm thinking here of, say, Horizon or European funding. Is that out the window now for UK-based companies, or is some of it still available?
No, there's still quite a lot that is available. Again, it's about making sure you approach it in a strategic way. So understand all of the available calls that are both live now and also kind of in the rumor mill, as it were. But no, there's European options for most organizations. There's also replacement calls coming up next year through things like the Shared Prosperity Fund. Again, focus slightly more on those capital type calls to replace those other ones that we're not eligible for anymore.
Okay.
So we've just submitted to a Horizon Europe bid with a European consortium. So it is still possible. The only kind of one of the main difficulties, I think, is the more human aspect of Europe. Some European entities might just be a bit scared in working with a UK company because you don't know what's going to get thrown up next year or the year after.
Yeah. Okay, so those are kind of some of the main funding bodies. Each of them is going to have their own quirks in terms of what they're looking for when you apply, but are there any kind of generally applicable principles that people should be thinking about? How do you maximize your chances of success? Tom, can I go there?
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider is just the amount of time and resources that you dedicate to the applications. They are competitive processes, and I don't know why, but it seems that some organizations maybe don't approach them in the same way that you would if you were going for equity investment. You know, this needs to have the same level of diligence in terms of what you're looking to spend the money on, why you're differentiating in the marketplace, why your team is excellent, what your plans are, your commercialization plans, how you're protecting your IP, as if you were going for an equity investor, and sometimes more so. So I think the first piece in terms of being successful is to put the amount of time in. It's also to be ready. So one of the drawbacks of grants is they can appear fairly quickly with quick turnarounds. But if you've done the preparatory work to be able to kind of springboard into the appropriate call at the right time, then you're always prepared for it. And I think it's then also about making sure that you're honest with yourself about what your strengths and weaknesses are. So everyone's innovative nowadays, and everyone differentiates, and you've got to really substantiate those claims. So it's not just, it's a slightly disparaging to marketing, which I value a lot, but it's more like a scientific paper that in terms of validating each of the claims that you make, in terms of referencing, in terms of statistics to back up any of those claims, working up also any assumptions that you've made, as opposed to selling your company in a more kind of marketing way that you would do if you were approaching a different kind of market.
And does being in a consortia help? Is that something that you usually suggest for people?
I think it's about a combination of the grant scope itself and the value. Don't go for consortia just for consortia's sake, because it adds a lot of time and complexity. However, sometimes people miss out on the softer benefits of the grant around the validation it brings, the opportunities to work directly with your customers and to help have them involved in the design and development process, which means that you've got a much greater chance of acceptance come the end of the project as well. So there's positives and benefits. It might be good. Jose, have you gone in on a consortium bid before this EU call?
So we've got a few bids involving consortia of 2 or more. The European one was a bit of a hydra. There's a lot of there's a lot of people involved in it, and I do pity the project leader, because he looked a little bit haggard by the end of the bid process of just trying to herd all of these cats that also, some things get lost in translation. I think it was 5 or 6 different countries were involved. But I think it's a good representation of the European Union and how it works anyway. But at the end, I think it was a pretty solid proposal. That can be quite draining, actually. And the draining aspect isn't the proposal writing itself or coming up with a project plan. It's just making sure that everyone understands what everyone else is doing. In terms of smaller consortia, like 2 or 3. So coming back to working with the end user or a customer, I think is vital. Not, vital in 2 ways. Vital for you as a company, because you need to know how to build your product so that the customer will want to buy it. And then the other side, the grants, your reviewer, the proposal will know that your technology is desired because the customer is putting in some risk and some time into helping developing it with you. So I think every bid proposal we're going kind of with forwards is only going to be with an end user, because again, we can spend. Scientists and engineers love to tinker with things and like developing new technology, and they can do that ad infinitum, as long as there's some money. But as a business, you need to build something you can sell. You need to guarantee that you're going to sell this technology once it's developed, and the best way to do that is to get your customer involved as early as possible. Coming back to the Defense Security Accelerator, they now emphasize that if you are going to put an ambitious bid in, that you should bring in 2 kinds of end users. You should bring in the defense, the government's end user. So whether that's a kind of a lieutenant colonel in the army, for example, that gives you a letter of support, and also if you're a startup, a larger scale kind of manufacturer or prime, that will actually build and sell the technology for you. You kind of need to show that those 2 end users and customers are in place to show that there's a need. And again, that's what we're going to be doing going forwards, is always involving a larger company or a military or security end user to kind of back us up in the need aspect.
That kind of comes to an interesting point, I think, because I think one of the things people struggle with some grant applications is that balance between the ambition of the project that you're talking about and the risk that comes with it. So you've talked about how you can sort of de-risk slightly by bringing in end users. Tom, is there anything else people can do, or how do they kind of get a view of how to get that balance right?
Yeah, the balance piece is vitally important. And it's about the balance between the risk and ambition. So the funders want risky projects, because one of the key things that you've got to demonstrate is that this is your funding option for this, i.e. it's not fundable via normal kind of debt or equity approaches. You need the grant in order to be able to achieve the ambition that you've defined. But just to give a bit of insight, I mean, if we take the Innovate Smart Call, which is the most well known, I would say, within that you've got 10 scored questions, and each question is 400 words limited. And each of the questions you need to answer generally around half a dozen different points. And each of those applications will get sent to 5 assessors. 2 of those assessors will have a technology awareness, 2 will have a market awareness, and 1 will be a layperson. So for 10 different questions, you've got to get across a minimum of half a dozen different points within 400 words to 5 individuals across 3 different areas, whilst maintaining consistency of message throughout and not repeating things so much that it detracts from the value of the bid. So that approach is all about balance. It's about making sure that you do emphasize the risks, but it comes back to that honesty piece. What the assessors want to see is that you understand fully the risks of the project and that you've put in place effective mitigation measures, not that there's no risk at all. And that's the balance piece they want.
So there is quite a point there about sort of, you talk about style versus substance, the substance of the application, the project, and the style with which you do the application. It is very important that you get that style right then, if you're kind of constrained in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about understanding exactly what the funder is looking for. Often funders aren't as effective at putting across the questions in the way they want them to be answered as they could be, which is possibly overly polite for some of the funders. But that boils down to, if they say they want the information for the work package presented in a Gantt chart, then present it in a Gantt chart. Because if you don't, you'll immediately be losing points on that. And it's about making sure you've addressed all of the kind of fundamentals and then build on that. I think the other piece just to touch on in terms of being successful is make sure that you get people to read it. Obviously protect your IP, so make sure you've got appropriate NDAs and similar in place. But often if you've written something, particularly if you've invested in that time in the balancing and the creating and keeping that kind of consistency of thread throughout, you're kind of almost too close to it. So make sure that you put that under the nose of advisors that you trust, or people who are in your kind of network who understand it to a certain extent, but also those that don't. Make sure that you're not too close to it so you can't understand it. And Josie's done very well at getting that message across, which is often one of the things we see entrepreneurs struggling with, is almost detaching themselves from it enough to effectively position it.
So if that's kind of how you make it successful, then where do people go wrong? Where do you see the kind of common mistakes arising? Tom, do you have a top 3 of things that people do wrong?
Yeah, I think the first piece sounds very simple, but it is the fundamentals. Check you're in scope. We've had really innovative we had a company of, I think they had 48 people who came to us, said they put in an application themselves. It had been really highly scored, but it was an application that was targeted on a particular city in the UK, and they were just outside the border, and therefore they're ineligible. And there's nothing they can do to change that. And it's those so make sure you get the fundamentals right. I think another area that people sometimes fall down in is just being able to position things clearly and in the appropriate way, and then making those unsubstantiated claims. Like, everybody can target $1 billion market with a small percentage and still come up with a big number. So it's not about those, we're going to get 10% of this market, as in just saying you're going to get 10%. It's about how you build up to that. And then any of the assumptions and use cases, it's the hard stuff. So, rather than saying your innovation is going to save a significant amount of time, detail that. For the average user, how many hours a day are you going to save? And it's a hard piece of work, so you've got to build in assumptions in those kind of areas, but you can then get a very powerful and compelling business case.
I think, part of it as well, it's a bit of when you're so involved in trying to tell the right story, we've made the mistake of forgetting that it's, for the most part, it's a tick box exercise for the reviewer. There's a set of questions that need to be answered, and you need to answer all of them explicitly. So our first ever kind of grant application for the ARMA kind of failed a little bit of that, because it just became a bit of a monolithic mess. And we missed half of the bullet points because we were so determined to explain what was so cool about our idea. Which comes down to the other mistake, is that we didn't properly leverage the friends that we had that were experienced in this. So we didn't really take this to our advisor and be like, a few of our advisors, and ask them to just take a hammer to whatever we've written. So yeah, the moment we realized it's a tick mark exercise, so now we literally put every paragraph has a title, which is the question that they're asking, so that the reviewer knows that, all right, this is the box that you need to tick here, that's the other box that you need to tick. But that comes with its own challenges of you're breaking up the story, but you still need to keep it flowing well, and you still need to keep it consistent. And that, I think, just takes a little bit of practice. You can also just have bad luck and have a bad review. One of our reviews, one of our unsuccessful bids, was that our project was simultaneously ambition and not good value for money, which made absolutely no sense. but there you go. But again, this comes back to maybe that review had a perspective that we didn't know. Having advisors and having friends come in and look at the application could also help paint those different perspectives to see that if there's any kind of glaring holes in there. One thing that really helped us get over these mistakes, because going beyond the advisors, was using the ecosystem that we're a part of, which is the Institute for Security, Science and Technology at Imperial College. So it's headed by Professor Deep Chana, who's an advisor of the company, but it gives you access to all the researchers at Imperial College. The ecosystem itself is bringing together academics from all over the country, well, all over the world actually, primes, so kind of top tier engineering companies, government people as well, a bunch of civil servants in the Home Office, in the MOD, in the Department of Transport. And these are people, and there is a physical office in Imperial's White City campus. And I think DASA's London kind of office, where the innovation partners sit, is in the White City campus. And you can literally just go up to them and say, right, I want to submit this project. This is how we're going to perform the project. What are your views? And they can just tear it down constructively, ideally. But yeah, it's getting as much advice as you can from a broader range of people as possible.
And in terms of kind of the amount that you're going for, so if you're going to all this trouble of applying for a grant, do you apply for the maximum the grant will let you apply for? Do you want to go for a nice round number? How do you sort of start working that out? Is there a better way to go about doing that?
The project costs as much as it's going to cost. There's no point putting in a submission that's going to cost you a lot more. So with Innovate UK, you have to find 30% to co-fund the project. But if it's in reality going to cost you 70% of the project, and you're going to go under halfway through the project, then what's the point of submitting for that project? You might as well just say, right, this is technology, this is how much it's going to cost, take it or leave it. If you're not going to fund it, I'm going to have to find money elsewhere. You'll be constantly in an uphill struggle if you're trying to find money to plug holes that you've created for yourself.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. If it's so under the smart call, you can apply up a project between 100 and 500k as a sole applicant, so you don't need the consortium members. And we often get asked, well, if it's $500,000, do we want to put in a £500,000 bid? So it's about building it from the ground up, making sure that it makes sense alongside the work plan. Again, putting in the time to make sure that it aligns. But if you do that and it gets to 600,000 in that example, and there's a £500,000 gap, then it's okay to still put in a £500,000 project. You've just got to find some of that extra 100,000 overspend that you're not able to do as part of this project. And the way to do that is to look at phasing. So bring it back to what is the core innovation, what's the core problem. And I think in terms of, to be successful, one of the key things to keep asking is why. So why is it that the market has this failing? Why is it that your solution is going to solve it? Why is it that you're the best team to do that? Why is it hasn't been solved to date? Are those kind of arguments compelling throughout? And that's the kind of the threads that need to run through all of the different headings that absolutely is best practice for writing these.
And so when you talk about phasing there, is that sort of saying rather than one big application, I'll do 2 or 3 smaller ones to kind of—
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So we've had clients who've come to us and say, I need absolutely a minimum of £1 million to achieve this. And actually, if you pare it back, the core innovation, that they are building this around is actually 400,000 of that million. And if they do that, not only will they get it covered by the grant, but also it validates it then for follow-on investment from equity or similar. So they've de-risked the whole £1 million, and they probably couldn't deliver that million all within that period anyway. So they deliver that first kind of 400, 500K, solve the real problem, do the real step change piece, build the barriers to other people coming into the marketplace as well. And that puts them in the right kind of footing for then going on and securing the follow-on funding afterwards, either via equity or similar or via another grant.
Okay.
I think that ties in well to what you alluded to before, which is you should treat a grant application like you would an equity funding round. And the phasing of the technology development should also be how you go through an equity funding round. You can ask for $1 million upfront at a horrendous valuation, or you can pare back, look at the fundamentals. Instead of spending $1 million, you spend 400,000 to develop your minimum viable product and find a couple of customers, and then your valuation will be double, triple, quadruple, and then the cost of that 600,000 will then be a lot less in your equity. So it plays both ways.
So you really have to think about the whole picture, the before and the after, and how it's going to play forward beyond the end of the grant.
Sorry, Emily. Yeah, I was just going to say there's one other thing around timeframes that's important. So you're going to have to define a project. Let's say it's that £500,000 project, and probably given timeframes, it's going to start in about kind of 5 or 6 months from today. So that's why it isn't as suitable for those kind of iterative development pieces, because you're going to have to define, a 12-month project that starts in 6 months, of which you know all the details too. So that's why you've got to make sure you think about it, how it's going to fit, what happens if you don't get the funding as well, and you need to have those contingency plans in place, and make sure you've thought about it, strategically, and also make sure you're not going for a fund that gives you 100K today, which then ties you in for 6 months, when you could actually be going for one that gives you 500,000 if you just waited a couple more months.
Yeah, and sometimes as well on that timescale part, even if an Innovate UK smart cycle opens up now and you've got 3 months to write the application, it has taken us half a year to get an NDA out of a particular engineering prime. We've had a conversation that the engineers are really excited. Their legal team has taken half a year to send the NDA. They sent it to us. I signed it the next day. I sent it back, and a month later they haven't countersigned it. The timescales are utterly ridiculous. And this was a company that we wanted to put on one of our grant proposals as a supporter, but we couldn't because they're just too damn slow. So you have to take that into account as well. Yeah.
That inherent uncertainty that comes with grant, that you might not get the money. You submit your Innovate proposal, and 4 months later you find out you're not successful, but you were thinking you were going to be starting in a month or two's time. Is there anything particular a business can do to kind of offset that risk or deal with that risk, or is that just the nature of the beast?
I think the first thing to bear in mind is to not give up if that does happen, because relatively few companies have a successful first time with a grant application. So build that into your planning. Again, the whole point is that the project should be ambitious enough that you can't just go and do it tomorrow anyway. But also don't let your business model don't let the tail wag the dog, as it were. So don't go in for the wrong fund and leaving you going off in a direction that doesn't fit with your business model. Make sure that you can carry on doing, you've got your kind of day-to-day plan that goes alongside it. And then should that be supported by a grant, excellent. But also spread those kind of irons in the fire, as it were. So if you can go in for multiple funds, go in for multiple funds. If you can talk to equity investors and at the same time, and you're asking for $1 million, but you get half of that through a grant, then your ask with them goes down, but prepare them for that. And then if you don't get the grant, then you can go for the full $1 million with them. So those are, it's about, again, managing the risk of it.
And thinking beyond the application process, is there anything you need to be aware of when you're writing the grant about how things work after grant? Some of the grants, I think you kind of claim back the money later. Some of them you might get grant money up front. They're those kind of things you need to be taking into account as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Josie, do you want to speak about this first? Because I guess from not knowing to knowing.
Yeah. So with each funding mechanism, we have a different experience. With DASA, it's deliverables based, and they pay you 100% of the project cost, and there's no auditing done on the whole project. So you state it's going to be that cost at the beginning, and they trust you to roll with it as long as you deliver. So that's pretty simple. So with DASA projects, you're given a technical partner within DSTL. So they become the bridge between your project and the wider MOD community, and they can advise on whether you're going in the right direction. They will try to find more end users for you. They'll give you feedback on your technology. So the deliverable is usually a report for every work package that you say you're going to do, and that can be a bit of a back and forth process. And you can have a difficult technical partner, you can have a really great one. You don't have a choice in the matter, but when they're good, they're really good, and they're really, really helpful. So I think that's the only difficult aspect of the DASA program. With Innovate UK, you have to go through a more audited process, at least with the first work package. I think you have to get your accountant to look through your accounts and prove your spending, and that's a bit more onerous. I think the main thing that people don't expect actually is the anticlimax of once the project is finished. You expect you expect magic to happen, that suddenly the customer's going to want to buy your technology and everything's all good and done. But no, what happens is you submit your final report, the funding body goes, thank you very much, good luck, and that's it. so it can be quite jarring, actually.
Yeah, I'll touch upon the kind of wider funders, but it's, I don't know, it's a bit similar to when you have a child as well. I've it's a slight tangent, sorry, but I felt like you have your
anticlimax.
Yeah, well, you have your first kid, and you kind of expect to be inducted through this magical door and be given this volume of how to be a parent. But it's just you with something that you've created that you care a hell of a lot for. It's still you, and there's not this kind of big change. Maybe comparing grant bids to children is not quite the right approach. But generally with kind of other funders like Innovate UK, you'd work through a quarter. You have to expend that out, hence the kind of the match funding, the 30% typically. There are options in the market to support that match funding. There are debt options, for example, to help get over that kind of hump. But then you'd repeat that for every quarter and put in an IAR, which is a report that validates those costs that you spent. The key thing I'd suggest is that you are explicit about the amount of project management time that it's going to require. So actually build that in. It's an allowable cost, put it in as half a role or a role, depending on how big the project is. So at least, even if that means having to hire in a project manager for the duration, because it's an allowable cost and they want these projects to be well run. So it's absolutely recommended to build that cost in and have it as part of the project.
And is there anything
also don't throw in that you're saying that you're going to be using agile methodologies just as a buzzword and don't actually do it. Like, if you're going to throw in a buzzword, at least know what you're going to do with that buzzword.
It's like AI again, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is there anything that, say on Innovate, you can't claim for or can't have met by the costs that people tend to be surprised by? Some of them I know won't fund IP, for example. Is there anything sort of similar to that people get caught out by?
I think with Innovate UK, you've got a due diligence period after being awarded, which is a further kind of 4 to 6 weeks. And most of the questions there are around the finances that you've put together. So you will get quizzed on them, you'll have to validate them. So you should be delivering against the project costs that you have put in. One thing that does throw people sometimes is that you can't make a return on your innovation during the project. So if you've got an 18-month project and you're developing out AI Engine X, for example, you can't actually charge clients for that in that 18-month period. So you can involve clients in it. You can offer it for free to existing clients, but you can't make a return on it until the end of that 18-month period. So you've got to be aware that if you are, if the first half of the project is developing the AI engine and then it's testing after that, in terms of your cash flow and your business model, you can't be generating an income from that directly in that second half.
Oh, that's interesting. That ties in somewhat with kind of VC funding as well, doesn't it? Because a lot of VCs will say it's actually better not to be making income in early stages, because you'll be sort of judged on that income. It's better to be making no money up until the point you ask for funding, and then project an ambitious income in later stages.
That's right. Yeah, it does the hockey stick.
If you have an asset to back that up. If you're building a SaaS-based model and you don't have any customers, you're like, they're going to come, then yeah, they're not really going to believe
if you book them, they will come. Great. Well, that's been really interesting. So I'd like to try and run through some of the questions that we've had from the audience. But before we do that, is there one final point from each of you, either something you particularly like the audience to take away with them, or something important that you haven't managed to say yet because I've not asked the right question? Jose, do you want to go first? Just sort of one big point.
For us, having a bunch of advisors or people that can advise us that have gone through the process before was the most valuable thing that we could have had to be successful in the grant funding. Grant funding is a skill. It has to be developed. There are things that you should do, there are things you shouldn't do. And when you're starting off, there's a lot of unknowns that need to be pointed out to you.
Great. Tom?
Yeah, I think I'd probably echo that. If, I would say to get as much advice as you can and make sure that advice is from people who've done it. Lots of people say they can help with grants. Drill down, how many applications have they put into that particular call or that funder? Really understand how they can add value, and just resource it effectively. There's no point trying to kind of wing it. It wastes everyone's time. So do it as a serious project, and it can get really great results. And just to finish, as Jose has demonstrated, loads of companies win grant funding all the time. It is an achievable thing, but you just need to do it in the right way. Yeah,
that's a really good point, actually.
We have had many unsuccessful bids as well. So it's,
Great. Well, okay, so I'm going to, in no particular order, I'll move on to some of the audience questions that we've had. So someone out there was particularly keen to find out if there's anything other than EIC, KTP or Innovate. So I think EIC is European Innovation Council funding, KTP Knowledge Transfer Partnership. Tom, tell me if I'm getting these right.
No, it's good.
And then Innovate we've talked about already. Yeah, is there anything else that I guess we haven't talked about? DASA. Is there any other big ones that we haven't touched on yet?
It depends a little bit on the sector. So, for example, you've got things like SBRI, which is a really good funder, where you're linking to public sector issues, as it were, and also that is done as more of a procurement. So actually, you can put in full kind of profit costs into it. Then you've got sector-specific ones. So yeah, ESA's the space one. Then you've got things like NHSX, for example, under the medical sector. So it really does depend on the sector. Make sure whoever you're talking to does a full kind of market sweep when they're assessing the potential funds. And then some of them are very localized or regional. So make sure they understand where the work's going to be carried out, because that might bring up some other options as well.
That brings us on nicely to the next question. How do you stay informed about where what funding there is, what's the environment like, what's available where? Is there, for someone starting out, is there some way you'd recommend they begin?
It's a time-consuming process. We do it the brute force method. You've got your normal kind of gov.uk websites. The next best thing to do is to speak to a KTN innovation lead, and they can point you towards competitions that are out or that may be coming out as well. They're the ones closest to the rumor mill because they're the ones generating the competitions or helping to generate the competition. Yeah.
I'd say the only way that I've managed to do it effectively is to set up a company that specializes in it. You've got to be on it 24/7. We've got dedicated people in the team that specifically focus on market intel effectively. I think the valuable bit, KTN, extremely valuable. It's almost the ones that aren't announced though that are the really valuable ones. the ones, again, kind of in the rumour mill, as it were, that you can prepare for then effectively, and start to build the consortium partners and start to define the project more effectively, that you know are coming up but might not be quite live yet.
I mean, looking beyond, so we spend a fair amount of time looking at the US grant funding ecosystem. So you can, as a foreign company, bid into DARPA bids, into Army and Navy and Air Force bids as well. Not all competitions are eligible for UK companies, but some are. You just have to look at the small print. And generally they have a lot more money than the UK.
And for small projects, so sub 50K, is there anywhere you guys would suggest that might be, would be your first port of call for that size of project?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the similar in terms of the people that can identify the projects, but I think there does get to a point where you're looking at then validation, and that kind of 50K generally is a level that you should be able to raise other funds. There's startup loans, there's other kind of funding options out there, because also your ability, if it's a feasibility study, then that will be in that kind of lower range, but to develop out a piece of technology, that's probably the starting point upwards that you'd be looking for.
And I guess the overhead of the grant writing time is, you need to justify that with.
There's a proportionality piece there, yeah, but that's also true of funders. So there was effectively a countryside grant scheme run by the European Union, where you had to get 3 quotes on anything over £1,000, and they were only offering 25K as a grant. And if that 25K was built up of 4 or 5 different items, then you've suddenly got to find 14 or 15, actual quotes for those items, and then you've got to prove it. So you've got to make sure that the return is proportional to the effort that you're putting in.
We've talked about AI. Is there a particular focus grant or call you think about for an AI business that would be useful at the moment?
Yeah, I think at the moment you're going to be looking at something like the smart call, depending on what sector you're in. I think the key thing with AI is the application of that to a sector. So it's likely, for example, if you're working in the medical sector, that all of the medical or a lot of the medical options would come up. And DASA, for example, you can take AI applications with a defense application and be successful there. So it's more about kind of where you're operating in, as well as what the actual technology is.
Yeah, the question doesn't tell me that, so I've got AI business to go on. So
yeah, AI isn't the end goal; it's just the enabler for the end goal.
And it can do anything and everything.
Yeah. And everyone's got it.
Everyone's got it. Every man and his dog is machine learning everything. Yeah.
So we've got an open question on the question and answer at the moment, that innovate seems very difficult, high admin and a slender financial offer. So how the personnel costs are calculated. Is it worth it? I mean, I think it is, because a lot of companies apply for innovate.
Yeah. It's definitely worth it. I mean, you don't have to pay it back. You don't have to give any equity away. You don't have to pay any interest on it. If you're talking about a £500,000 project of which you get 350K grant, I'm happy to talk, Paul, about the kind of the personnel costs, because you put in people's full time, you get an uplift of overhead of 20%. So actually it can work out extremely valuable. Yeah, and there aren't any sales during the grant period, but the grant period should be focused on developing the thing. So you shouldn't be anticipating a much longer grant period than the actual development phase anyway. So yeah, hopefully that answers it, but it's definitely worthwhile, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, but at least the difficulties in a grant project, they're all predictable. If you get your funding from an investor, you might have a bunch of difficult investors. So you're not just bringing in the money, you're also bringing in politics into the company, and that can be more emotionally draining than auditing your spreadsheet for the Innovate UK.
Yeah, especially if you've budgeted for your project management costs as well, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think the very final question, which I think we've already covered, but how important is it that you have someone with detailed knowledge of the funding process to assist with the written application? I think the answer here would be very from everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
I think Tom might like that question.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, without it sounding like an advert, it comes back to making sure they've got that expertise. and it's proven. Like I could have a pretty decent stab at our accounts and get reasonably close, but I wouldn't want them to submit them. So I get an accountant in to help. And I think it's about that it is just going back to that kind of, 400 words to answer to 5 different audiences, etc. There's a lot of work and expertise in being able to do that well and consistently, as well as the kind of softer pieces you can bring in from the relationships you've got with funders. So that's where the true kind of value is.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of all the questions we've got, and we're 4 minutes before our scheduled finish time. So I think we can take that as a win. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time today. It's been really interesting and hopefully it's been useful for the people out there. So I think that brings us to the close. I'll just say goodbye and then I'll end the session. So thanks, goodbye.